Welcome into the quick crash course in the Queen's Gambit. I'm Grandmaster Igor Smirnov, and I'll walk you through everything that you need to know about it. First off, what are the advantages of the Queen's Gambit compared to a bit more common pawn to e4 first move? Now, the Queen's Gambit is a very universal chess opening. I played it from beginner all the way to Grandmaster level. It served me really well. Secondly, it is a very solid opening. Here, notice that your queen protects this pawn on d4. Therefore, it is impossible for your opponent to start any early attacks against this pawn and to somehow capture it. Secondly, your king is very well protected. It has this additional little bodyguard around it, which makes it a lot more secure. Plus, thanks to this pawn on d4, there are no bishop c5 as we have in the Italian game, and it's much harder for your opponent to attack your king early in the game. It's virtually impossible. Therefore, all in all, d4 is a very solid choice, and a little later I'll show you how to spice it up and make it more aggressive for you. Alright, what should black play here? Let me explain you all the moves, because I don't want you to try to memorize it, it's impossible, but when you understand all the moves, it makes it just natural and smooth. Alright, so here with the move pawn to d4, you're trying to occupy the center. And the next move that you plan to play is pawn to e4. If your opponent plays something passive, it allows you to play e4, and now you grab the center completely. Therefore, your opponent cannot play any random move. They have to block this move pawn to e4, which would establish the strong center. Now, if they wish to control this square, basically they only have two options, which is the move pawn to d5 or knight of 6, and both of them would control this e4 square. Now, d5 is a lot more common, especially on amateur level, and after the move pawn to c4, we're getting the Queen's Gambit. Now, the other question you may have here is why to play c4 versus any other normal move? Well, the thing is, of course, you could just develop, something like that, and it's perfectly fine. But the issue is, if you wish to get ahead somehow, if you wish to dominate in the center, it's pretty hard to do that. Because how can you possibly attack black center right here? How can you get an advantage? Playing e4 is really hard, virtually impossible. Black controls it really well. And this brings us to the point that maybe you need to undermine it differently with the move pawn to c4. It looks like you're gambiting a pawn, and it is called a Queen's Gambit. However, in reality, we're not going to sacrifice a pawn. Due to Trump's tariffs, importing new pawns from China is getting really impossible, so we gotta be frugal with the ones you have. Now, this is a false gambit. If your opponent accepts our bait, on amateur level, this is actually a common error, because here after pawn to e3, you're getting ready to get this pawn back while establishing your domination in the center, and if your opponent is trying to be stubborn and to hold on to this extra pawn, that is actually quite a well-known trap, one of the main traps of the Queen's Gambit. Here, you're playing pawn a4, trying to undermine this pawn chain, and if your opponent captures this pawn right here, then it's clear that he missed the class in pawn structures, and you're going to get all these pawns back, ending up with a better position. If your opponent instead tries to defend this pawn, then it also leads to funny twin variations. If he goes pawn a6, guarding the pawn this way, then after the trade, all of a sudden, he loses this rook on a8. Now, if instead black tries to guard this pawn this way with this pawn from the c-file, then after the trade, somehow, once again, he's going to lose the very same rook in the corner of the game. And the rook has all the reasons to complain that life is unfair. I did nothing wrong. There are so many idiots around, but yeah, that's life. We'll move on to the classical lines in a moment, but for now, let me just stick a little more with this Queen's Gambit accepted variation, because that's what you're going to see most frequently on lower rating levels. And then I'd say that this move is a mistake, because your opponent probably doesn't know what they're doing. They just see this free pawn right here, and they think that it is the easiest way for them to solve this tension. Now, Grandmasters also play the Queen's Gambit accepted, and I have another video, which I'll link down below, where I explain how to play correctly as black, and then it can be a great opening weapon. But again, when beginners play this, it's usually just a misunderstanding. They thought that they could win this pawn or something like that, and they just played badly after that. So, if black goes knight of 6, you just get this pawn back, and you successfully tricked your opponent. Now, you have this central presence, and your opponent has nothing. So after that, if both sides just develop their pieces, you're going to end up a position with more space in the center of the board. Maybe in the future, you're even going to push this pawn to e4 and then dominate right here completely and press your opponent. If they ever try to play bishop g4, there are different ways to handle this, let's put it that way. So first off, there was rumors that when Mikhail Tal was a kid, just learning chess, he misunderstood and he thought that in the Queen's Gambit you're supposed to sacrifice a queen, so he played knight a5, and after bishop takes d1, finished the game in style. But, to be honest, it was not a correct sacrifice. The correct way of going about this is the zigzag method. When your opponent goes right, you go left. So here you go queen to b3 with this double attack, you attack this pawn, and then this knight, and also this pawn on f7, and black is already going down from here. If they try to play bishop takes f3, hoping that doubling pawns will worsen your pawn structure, you say, you know what, I'm not going to double my pawns, I'm just going for this checkmate. Now we're approaching the main line. It is the move pawn to e6, just guarding this pawn on d5. To this you respond with knight to c3, adding some more pressure to the central pawn on d5, and also possibly getting ready to break open the center with the move pawn to e4, which would once again be sure that you dominate in the center. They need to counteract, and therefore the correct move for them is knight to f6, opposing basically their knight to the same squares. Now they reinforce the defense of this square, they also control this one, so you can't play e4 anymore, and now you're at the crossroad. The main move is bishop g5 right here, but knight f3 is also possible, and they're considered to be equally good, but I think that knight f3 is going to work better for you. Let me explain. If you play bishop g5 right here, then most of your opponents are going to see this pin and are going to neutralize it with bishop e7, and they're doing perfectly fine. Now, let's take it back. If instead, right here, you start with playing knight to f3, the move which you were going to play anyway, most of your opponents are going to respond with bishop b4, thinking that this is a more active move which pins your knight. But now bishop g5 is much more unpleasant for your opponent, because now they do not have that bishop to come to e7 and to neutralize the pin. Well, this pin is actually not a problem. You're going to castle kingside within a few moves anyway, getting your king out of danger. Therefore, this bishop on b4 is going to be useless and is going to do nothing. Now, once again, if some of you are very advanced, and you may say, Igor, but like super grandmasters play this move as well. Yes, but that's a totally different story. They have totally different plans in mind, all right? So when beginners play this, they just misunderstand what to do in an opening, and it is just an incorrect move. Now, so after bishop g5, very often they'll actually follow up with one more mistake. They're going to take on c3, which is going to reveal that they made the biggest blunder. They're not following this channel, and they don't know that to take is a mistake. Because right here, they opened up this semi-open file for your rook, they strengthened your center, they wasted 2 moves doing so, and achieved nothing, which is great for you. Now here, if they also feel that this pin is annoying, and they'll try to somehow get rid of this pin, then of course you just slide your bishop backwards and you still maintain the same pin. If they ever go g5, then it's even better for you, because now this becomes a permanent weakness. It's getting really hard for them to castle kingside in this game, because now this kingside position is very weak. You can always play h4 in the future and undermine this pawn. In fact, black's position is already quite tough. You're going to simply play e3, bishop d3, standard moves of the queen's gambit, and at some point probably h4, kicking this pawn, and your opponent is going to fall apart. If your opponent is more advanced, he won't be so cooperative, and then he'll probably just castle, but then you play e3 in order to strengthen your center and also to develop your bishop on the next turn. If your opponent ever goes h6, as always, we just slide back, maintaining this pin. Then your opponent will do something. They need to develop these queenside pieces somehow. It doesn't really matter, because your moves are very simple. You're going to play bishop d3, developing your bishop, and then a castle after, no matter what. Let's say they play knight to d7, trying to provide some additional support for this knight, and then there is a little hint right here. So of course you could just develop your bishop and castle, and that's perfectly fine. Your position is absolutely all right. But a little downside is if you bring your bishop out right away, then your opponent can take right here on c4 and sort of waste your move, because now you have to bring your bishop to c4 in 2 moves instead of just in 1. So after bishop takes c4 and c5, after this trade, the position becomes more symmetric and a little bit drawish sometimes. Of course, your opponent still can blunder a queen within the next couple of moves and lose. But anyways, it is considered a little bit more prudent for white to actually trade on d5 first. Because notice that after this trade, then you bring the bishop out, and now your opponent can take right here and force your bishop to move twice in an opening. So now after black plays whatever, you castle, and you successfully completed your development. This is what you're going to do in all the variations across the queen's gambit. Bring the bishop here, knight here, castle, very solid position. Now if you look at it, of course the position is more or less equal, but nevertheless it's more comfortable for you. You have this pin, which is a little bit annoying for black. This bishop on b4 is not doing anything. The trade on c3 is only good for you. In general, bishop is a little bit stronger than a knight. You're probably going to play queen to c2 just to complete your development, so that your queen is out, your rooks are connected, everything is solid. Maybe you're going to bring your knight right here to this nice outpost square. And for black, it's also a little bit harder to develop this light square bishop, which is kind of stuck right here behind these pawns and pieces. Therefore, it's slightly better for you. Now, if you wish to navigate through such positions easier, I've got a free masterclass about positional play, which you can check it out by clicking the link below the video, and you can learn it there. Another surprisingly common move of black here is defending the central pawn with a knight, which is another mistake. Here after pawn takes d5, your opponent cannot hold on to their center. If they bring the queen out, then after knight to c3 you kick the queen back and then you grab the center, have all these lines and diagonals for your pieces, and life's good. If instead your opponent recaptures with the knight, then it leads to a similar outcome. You still grab the center, kick this knight back, and now you can also set a little nice trap along the way. You defend your central pawn with the bishop, and if your opponent thinks that you missed that the pawn on d4 is no longer defended, then you hit him with the bishop, and it also opens up this discovered attack of the queen. But now they have to somehow block the king check, so if they play knight to c6 trying to guard the queen that way, you can send this knight to depression by showing it that it's totally useless after queen takes d4. While the previous trap mostly works against beginners, the next one is going to work even against advanced level opponents. Here, instead of playing e4 right away, you can also play knight f3 first, which is a much trickier move. Because if your opponent plays the most natural response, knight to c6, also developing a knight, now you play e4, kicking this knight out, and after knight f6, attacking this pawn, you can play knight to c3. Now, your opponent feels annoyed that these pawns can move forward easily and drive away these knights. Therefore, they're likely to play bishop g4, trying to start their own counterattack, put pressure, attack this knight, and therefore this pawn on d4. For now, it looks like black is doing well, but you play d5, kicking this knight away. And now what can they do? They realize that the knight does not have any good squares, because yes, it can go back, but it's just very passive and it simply wastes time. Going right here loses after queen to a4 with this double attack, and black is going to lose the knight anyway. And if the knight goes here to e5, that once again looks very advantageous for black at first, trying to take advantage of this pin on your knight, but then all of a sudden you sacrifice your queen, and after bishop takes, you go bishop b5 check, and despite being up a queen, black is actually defenseless. Your knight and bishop are teaming up really well, controlling all these squares, and if black covers, you just take, also having all these threats of a discovered check from the bishop, and again, black has no defense. If let's say they trade, bishop takes c6 comes with another check, finally they have to block, but after bishop takes, they now have to give the queen back, and once the dust settles, we can see that in an endgame, white is up a knight and a pawn in a very simple endgame position where black has no counterplay, so hopefully it can win. With that being said, you gotta be careful because your opponent can pull off a very similar trap himself. Here in the main line of the Queen's Gambit, they can play knight to d7, and at first it looks like they just blundered this pawn on d5 due to a lot of the pressure that you have right here. So at first it seems that you can trade and then grab this pawn thanks to the pin. However, black can sacrifice the queen all of a sudden, and once you accept it, then they come up with this check bishop b4, and somehow it turns out that there is no piece that you can use to cover your king other than your own queen. But then they happily grab the queen back, and at the end of the line, they're ending up with an extra piece in an endgame. And if you want to know a proven study plan to reach 2000 ELO faster, check out this video right there.